There we go. Oh, for a minute there, freaked me out because it froze, but it's okay. All right, so we'll jump back in. So usually we talk about two types of generalization: the standard statistical generalization, quantitative, right, post-positivistic, from all those reviewers that say things to us like, you don't have enough people to be able to do X, Y, and Z. Um, we learned probably in some grad class about true experimental design, right, which you need to have in order to be able to generalize large random numbers of participants. And in that kind of generalization, we're generalizing to the population, right? Some percentage of people believe this way, or some percentage of people are liberal Democrats, or some kind of characteristic. The other kind of generalizability is substantive type of generalizability. So this fits in more with qualitative and mixed, although qualitative researchers, if you read the article, talk a lot. There's like a gazillion different ideas of generalization, some of whom had like 5 or 6 different types of generalization. Frankly, I think it's a keep it simple kind of thing. I think that if we muddy it too much, it gets too complicated for typical people to just really grasp what's going on. Uh, Substantive types of generalizability don't require large numbers of people. And it's not about generalizing to the population. It's about generalizing about the population. So the idea really is not about percentages, or as Steve Brown says, I think in political subjectivity, it's not about counting noses, right? Instead, it's right about looking at or for types of people. So we have generalization based on statistical inference, allows a researcher to extend the findings from a large random sample of participants to a larger population. And then we have generalization based on substantive inference, which has to do with types of phenomena, right, occurring in a population, right? So substantive inference occurs when the focus is more qualitative. We're looking at the phenomenon itself. So who cares and so what, as my dissertation advisor used to say. Man, my disclaimer is my dissertation was not a Q dissertation. It was full of R methodology and linear regression and all kinds of fun things. But we care because considerations related to generalization are often interconnected to researcher judgments about the quality of a methodology or the quality of the study, which brings us to talk about methodological pluralism, right? Where, quantitative and people and in general. And, right, the idea that there's only statistical inference and statistical generalizability really puts quantitative in a position that is greater and more important, right, and better than any kind of other kind of research, qualitative or mixed or other. So the intent of Q, right, is to uncover operant subjectivities. They're real. They exist in the real world, right? And we're not interested in counting noses, again, from Steve Brown, right? So why can't we generalize in Q, right? And the upshot is that we certainly can. So for a long time, I've referred to the Thomas and Boss 1993, I think, paper, The Issue of Generalization in Q Methodology, Reliable Schematics Revisited, which is in operant subjectivity. And that's where they talk about two types of generalizability. One of the things I found, and kind of the impetus for me creating, right, this paper, is that it'd been 30 years, and that really Thomas and Boss's article just didn't get the attention that it needed to. And I also wanted to update it such that it was a little broader and also addressed this idea of, right, methodological pluralism, that we should be seen, right, methodologically, we're all on the same level. One methodology isn't, right, inherently better than the other because one uses numbers or some kind of thing, right? Generally, right, as I kind of mentioned, the Boss and Thomas article been ignored a lot. Campen and Tomas, who I like to refer to a lot, were very critical. They were in, had an article in 2014, and then there was a back and forth between some Q methodologists and Campen and Tomas and Campen about Q methodology, and they included lack of generalizability as one of their list of imperfections related to Q methodology. And then there have been others, right? People who have talked about what a wonderful methodology Q is, and it provides such great insights. But then, right, they declare that Q is not generalizable. And there's a whole list of people, right, some of whom I think have changed their minds, looking at some of their older papers where they've talked about the lack of generalizability in Q. And of course, this idea that Q is not generalizable then leads these other researchers to suggest to us how we can fix our broken methodology. Yeah, just like, we need more people, we need to do this, we need to do that, right? We need to do, 2 consecutive studies and compare them in order to show that our results are reliable, and, the usual list of, if only you Q people could do it right kind of things. I will point out that Watson Stenner talk about substantive inference. They don't necessarily talk about substantive generalization, but they do talk about substantive inference, and they mention specifically the Thomas and Boss article from 1993, and say that it's an excellent article on generalization and reliability issues in Q. They don't go much further than that, but happy to see that they mentioned it. One of my favorite quotes, which is an article, is from Spillman from 2014, so about 10 years ago, which is, what explanatory purpose is served by quantitative analysis of large numbers? And this is really kind of a jumping off point about why we need substantive generalizability. Because we're into, right, explanatory, descriptive. We can't just say that because we don't have large random samples of people that somehow our results are unimportant or ungeneralizable. So in the paper, which one of the original reviewers did not like, I have screenshots from my no longer my 2010 or 2011 Honda Odyssey. But because I've always been kind of a numbers person, right, when I got this car 10 years ago, I was fascinated by watching the miles per gallon and what I could do, right, to influence the miles per gallon that I was getting, because it shows up on a digital screen. And so I always wanted to do something with this, because it says so much about data, having enough data, how you can influence data, and it's just miles per gallon. So everybody kind of understands that. Most people know about cars. So in my example, right, I drove my minivan all around, right, and collected a large amount of data, just short of 1,000 miles. And when I drove 1,000 miles, highway and city, right, I had 24.0 miles per gallon. And then I went in and said, well, what if I just do highway, right? Well, I can't drive 1,000 miles on the highway, right? I mean, I guess I could, but I would end up 1,000 miles from here, and then what would I do? And I'd have to stop somewhere along the line. So I'm looking at phenomenon. So instead, I just drove for 10 miles on the highway. Got 31.4 miles per gallon. The number here isn't as important as the idea that highway driving, where it was relatively flat, the phenomenon is that my gas mileage went up a great deal. If then I drove 11 and a half miles and it was all city driving, my miles per gallon dropped down to 21.5. So now I can see the influence, the phenomenon of driving in the city. My mileage is less than, right, the two together. So now I can start making generalizations, right? I can get better gas mileage on the highway than I can in the stop and go world of the city. And then just for fun, I replaced my air filter, right? And then I drove for 350 miles. And my gas mileage got better than it was when I drove 1,000 miles. So I drove 1,000 miles. My old air filter, my miles per gallon was 24 miles per gallon. And with my new air filter, I went like 350 miles and it was 24.5. Again, it's not the number that's so important. It's the idea. The phenomenon is, oh, look, you should not let your air filter get really dirty. It's going to affect your miles per gallon. So again, right, it's not the miles per gallon per se, right, the noses that we're counting. We're looking at the phenomenon. And that is the idea in Q and in a lot of qualitative research and mixed research when we're looking at phenomenon, right? We can still generalize, and we actually generalize to phenomenon all the time. Right, so we could look at color samples in a paint store, right, and make decisions about this will look nice in my living room, right? Barbara McClintock is a famous maize geneticist who learned about DNA of corn, and when she did that, she didn't look at, right, a random sample of corn, right, from across the United States or something. She was at an experimental farm in Cold Harbor, New York, and she actually looked at a really small sample. But what she was looking for was phenomenon. She wasn't trying to count noses, right? Even Einstein's confirmation of relativity based on a solar eclipse, right? Relativity, it's accepted universally. One data point, right? Einstein watched one solar eclipse, right, and looked at things that confirmed his theory of relativity. So these are, again, other ways of generalizing where we're not generalizing to the population, but we're generalizing about the population. So in kind of summary, right, the idea is researchers must provide explanations regarding how their studies' results are generalizable or why generalizability is unimportant within their study. This is something that we really need to do more of in our Q papers, right, and our studies and our publications, along with also explaining why validity, right, and therefore reliability is not an issue within Q. But overall, we need to accept different types of generalizability in order to provide a more equitable lens for good social and behavioral research, regardless of its labels of quantitative, qualitative, mixed, or other. So, and that's pretty much what I have, and I'm hoping that we can open up the floor here and talk a little bit more about generalizability and maybe just things in general about Q that seem kind of mysterious or disconnected or anything like that. Everybody just looks
I have questions.
okay. I love
Thank you,
questions.
Sue. Me
I'm
too.
I'm I'm so glad that in R, somebody who knows so much about R, because again, I come to this qualitatively, wrote something like this to help people like me be able to explain it to our people because I'm not going to be able to write that article ever. So we're very appreciative for you.
Oh, thanks.
Um, so I guess what I'm thinking to myself right now is the way I typically frame it is I say, and I can't remember right now because I'm not looking at my manuscripts where I say this, but Q is generalizable to perspectives of the same kind.
Hmm.
Um, and so that's how I'll describe in a write-up what my generalizability is. Two perspectives of the same kind or two opinions of the same kind. And for the viewpoints that I found, I can generalize to those viewpoints. And I may have missed viewpoints. There may be more viewpoints that I did not get. But I did get these. These are there, and this is what my understanding is what they mean. And so to those who think the same way, this is my understanding of why they think that in terms of their own reasoning, how they describe their operant subjectivity. Um, Help me understand how I can build on my my go-to three phrases for describing it with the research that you did kind of building this. So where do I take it next if that's kind of where I default to right now?
I think that's a good starting point. I think that both Brown and Stevenson do a good job of framing this in that there's only a finite number of viewpoints that are going to exist, right? So you might have found two, right? And maybe there's four because in your piece set you only right had those types of people, um, but those types of people will exist elsewhere, not just in your population. So I think that that's part of what we need to get across to people is that and kind of like oh no, now my brain's going to shut down too. Oh, in cultivating Q, who did all the different solutions, somebody help me. um Diane, you know.
Uh, why? Don't tell it now. All of a sudden, I forgot his name.
Yeah, I forgot his
The
name.
guy in Brazil, the guy in Brazil,
Yeah. Oh,
right?
Braswell. Yeah. Yeah. So I mean, there's only, and it's. I think that that chapter helps us also frame that what we did to uncover those viewpoints, right? In the long run, right? We could have uncovered it different solutions, right? Because we end up with the same basic types, right? It just how focused in we might be, or if we miss a view. So, for instance, I'll talk about my engineering undergraduate retention study. I could have stuck with a two-factor solution, but if I did that, I would have missed two of the most interesting viewpoints. One of which was about how they're going to be successful. I'm paraphrasing. They're going to be successful, but they felt like they really didn't fit in at the university or within the program, right? And African American woman student was very vocal about exactly why that was, right? And I wanted to have make sure that her voice was heard, right? That was one of the reasons why I picked the four factor solution because it allowed her voice to be heard. The other voices that I wanted to be heard was factor three, which these were students who they got into the program. I mean, they must have met the qualifications, right, which have ACT score and high school grade point average requirements, and but they didn't feel right. They didn't have any. They had lacked self confidence because so many of the engineering courses and some of the hard science and math courses are curved. I could go on and on and on about why I don't curve, but that's a whole different story. But right? These students were often on the lower part of that forced curve. And I wanted their voices to be heard because that's why they lacked confidence, was because a professor was constant. I mean, this is what they wrote, right? These were all in the comments. All right. And so these are the voices that really spoke to me, and I wanted to make sure that they came out, right? So as one of the students wrote, something to the effect of, if half your class is below the average, then faculty should be looking at themselves and wondering why I'm not reaching half the students in this class. And then went on about how basically this process, right, made him feel. And so I think that sometimes when we say that we only have two factors, right, sometimes we're missing something like that. I mean, it kind of ties into the generalizability idea that if I would have picked the two-factor solution, I would have had two of the four, right, viewpoints that existed within that group of 106 students. Right? If I got 200 students to reply, maybe I'd still only have four factors, right? Chances are I would. I mean, I had factor 3 had 3 students on it, factor 4 had 6 students on it, right? But again, right, we also have to be cognizant of the fact that the number of people on the factor, right, doesn't tell us how strong it is or what percentage of the population, right? Factor 1 was had the 25 people on it, I think, right? That doesn't mean that the factor 1 view is somehow more important. So I think there's a lot of things that we have to get across in that way, but that allows us to focus on the phenomenon, right, and not the number. I think it also helps in the idea of flagging, right, people on a factor. So, right, so I think I had 25 people on factor 1, 18 or 20 on factor 2, 3 on factor 3, and 6 on factor 4. That's certainly not everybody, right? But these were the people who loaded heavy on one factor, right? And and so that allowed me, right, to then focus in on those students that really fit into that box. Were there students who were a little bit factor 1 and a little bit factor 2? Sure, right? Those people always exist. So and I know that sometimes students feel, or researchers feel, like they're throwing something away when those voices don't get to be heard. But I think of it a little bit like, I'm going to switch into physics mode, right? It's like significant figures, right? So we can do significant figures, right? And we have, right, we put numbers in our calculator, and I don't know, 2 divided by 3 gives us 0.666666666, right? But chances are we'd write it as 0.67, right? I'm kind of schlepping over some of the details of significant figures, but right, because that's enough to tell us, right, what 2/3 is equal to. I've kind of lost my train of thought again. But did I answer your question, Joanna?
A little bit. You have me, while we're on this subject, I want to take it a step further because I don't want to lose this train of exciting thought that I'm in thinking about what you're saying. So, and I think what's helpful about, even though I know absolutely nothing about the words you just said, and now I know how other people feel when I throw out my field jargon. What I do understand is that sometimes, for what you're trying to talk about, something that loses some of the meaning is okay. Mm-hmm. Because you're trying to get at this other sort of phenomenon, right? That's a helpful concept. That's something I can play with. I think what I'm kind of going to now, though, is thinking, so I recently read, I mean, I think it was a month or two ago, but Stephen's chapter on marginalization. Q as a marginalizing.
Mm-hmm. Yes, Yeah, marginalized methodology for marginalized voices or something like
Yeah,
that.
exactly.
Mm,
But he and I were corresponding around third world development and sustainable
mm,
development and stuff like that. So he sent me the empowerment one and then the marginalization one. And I think that it really stuck with me listening to you because it feels like we could almost take this a step further in terms of thinking about generalizability to say almost that Q has a superpower that other methods don't have. So it's not just that we should be on the defensive to say, wait, but we matter
mm,
too. Because there is a benefit to using R sometimes.
right.
When we need to understand health concerns and wide swaths of population, R is a wonderful method. Um, and when we need to go into villages and understand why people refuse to use birth control, ethnography is an incredible method. So, it's not to say that they need to be equal. It's that there are strengths to each in different situations, and they're sort of tools in a tool belt. Um, and I think that, we could almost turn it and say Q has a superpower that should be kind of appreciated more, used more, which is this marginalization, finding voices that aren't heard and understanding them. And I think that, and it reminded me, so at the moment we're taking the study I did with these 20 voluntary organizations, and we're extending it to 40 businesses. Um, and so it reminded me a lot of your analogy of changing the air filter,
Mm-hmm.
because it's not so much about the number of people. And it was actually really cool to work with this senior leadership scholar and to turn him on to Q. He kept going, really? You can just, I said, I think we could do this with 2025. He goes, we need 40. And I said, we don't need 40. And he goes, I believe you now. I don't know why, but I believe you. A really funny sort of
Mm-hmm.
conversation. But it's a great example, I think, of that marginalization, because you can take that first pot and find that marginalized view and then add the air filter and sort of compare those sorts of viewpoints between that. And it allows, I think and maybe this is the argument you made in terms of generalizability. I'm just trying to flesh this out more so that those of us who are trying to write you up and explain it and add our own take, because that's how I'm imagining this, right? How am I going to bring this into the way that I do write this up for publication? And I think there's something to be said for how we can take these different scenarios and change the air filter or drive it slightly differently and examine the way that the phenomenon shifts, and sort of throw all of the R stuff in the trash because it's irrelevant to those questions. I was kind of narrating out loud there, but
Well,
I
and,
feel
and
like
and if you think about it,
going
what you're
forward.
really saying is then you could change the condition of instruction and have them sort again. Which, if you haven't done a study where you have people sort under the same statements under multiple conditions, I really recommend that. It's fun and it's really insightful. I really only did that once, and it was a study about epistemology, student epistemology, and it took place in I think three different classrooms, and then I had the faculty, the instructors of record, also sort, but they sorted under three different conditions of instruction where they sorted right their ideal student, their typical student, and how they would sort it. And it was so fascinating to look at. Never got published, but it was so fascinating to see how in step some faculty were, right, with this typical student idea, right, and some people, right, their ideal student, their typical student, right, aligned with one of the student views. And then there were some where I don't know what planet they were on, but it wasn't the same planet as the students. So, but to me, that's what you were saying, Joanna, about changing the air filter. We can set a different, change our phenomenon in a little bit, right, by just choosing different conditions of instruction. But I think that the superpower of Q is that it allows us to differentiate viewpoints. I think that that's the biggest thing, because in R and right linear regression, general linear model, and even in ethnography, what we're really doing is we're, as we say in teaching, right, we're shooting for the middle, right? So that we're looking for things that are in aggregate, so that, for instance, right, the retention study that I did, right, if you look at the literature, right, they list traits of people who changed their major. And then they say, oh, but people who stayed in their major have these same traits. But they're all just, they don't have all the traits, right? They can't all be men, women, black, white, right? Working, not working. I mean, that doesn't make any sense. So we have different things that, right, kind of make that tipping point about whether or not they're going to change their major. But the good news is that it's not, right, we have 106 sorters. We don't have 106 unique viewpoints that are disconnected from everybody else's. And Q magic, right, allows us to say, hey, you know what? There are 4 views. And here they are, and now I can describe them in great detail. I mean, that's really how I got hooked into Q, because it answered questions that up to that point I wanted to answer, but all of the quantitative stuff I knew didn't let me ask those questions and answer them. Yeah, Joe.
I really like the concept of Q as a superpower. When I was did my research, so I'm looking into the concept of possible sales on the part of secondary school age students and how they view their futures in relation to participation in higher education. And I had this idealistic idea that I would involve students in a range of different socio-economic backgrounds. So I'd contact get all these schools involved, some in sort of highly affluent areas, others in more deprived areas. And because of COVID, the ability for schools, we were just coming out of restrictions, was really limited. They just wanted to get back on the straight and narrow, delivering their core curriculum. And so I only managed to work with 2 schools, and I was really, really worried. And I talked to my supervisors about it's ruined my study. I'm just not going to be able to get any results from this. But ultimately, even though I was working with what other people would have seen as quite a homogenous group of students, I was able to identify 3 really distinct viewpoints. And my supervisor was saying, well, look, this is the power of the method that you're using, that you're able to do that, whereas other people's would have maybe just not seen, they would have seen them as a homogenous lump, and the idea that they all had similar views to, how their futures and that sort of thing. So I really do like the idea that, rather than coming on the defensive, that we can turn around and say, well, how else would we have identified these different viewpoints within this homogenous group?
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, because they're homogenous based on characteristics that aren't necessarily deterministic of their subjective viewpoints. Mm-hmm. And I think that is its superpower. I could do linear regression or hierarchical linear modeling, right, and look for characteristics that, right, result in, right, a higher post-test score on the force of motion conceptual evaluation, but that doesn't tell the whole story, right? The whole story has to do, because later on I converged my dissertation research with Q and found out that students who thought had certain epistemological viewpoints, they were the ones who scored the highest on the post-test. And They wanted to understand. They were seeking understanding, and they got it. The other 2 views were, I want a good grade in this class, and I don't remember what the other one was. But that's basically what it was, I don't want to work too hard, putting words in their mouth. But those are the things, again, that you're right, Joe. I mean, things like age and gender and, right, none of those things affected the subjective viewpoints. And you know, maybe I could draw back into some kind of cultural thing, but I think that it speaks to the fact that, right, we're kind of each of us is an amalgamation of lots of different experiences and our inner voices, what we say to ourselves and what we think. And the fact that, right, there's not 106 unique views in a piece set of 106 tells us a lot of really important things about people, but also what the magic of Q is. Other questions?
Professor?
Mm. Oh.
It's Nico. I wanted to ask a question about the validity of Q. So I'm in the process of submitting my proposal to the Research Ethics Committee. And the one feedback I keep getting is that the validity aspect of Q is going to be judged heavily, because it seems like what I've been reading from your studies that they're going to assess the quantitative aspects of Q in the standard statistical way. Like they're going to say, no, like you're saying, where's your 100 participants? No, this study, it's a bit flawed because you're trying to mix in qualitative and quantitative. So that's it makes them uncomfortable. So my question is, how do I convince such a rigorous committee that, look, my study is legit. It just follows a certain methodology that's different from yours?
Oh, and that's a great question. And I think it's one of the things that we often have the greatest difficulty with, whether it's a dissertation committee or reviewers, and that is in quantitative world, right? We have a survey, right? And we do psychometrics to show that, you know, that our instrument is both valid and reliable. And, you know, maybe we do R factor analysis and we group things together, and, right, and we do face validity and expert validity and all of those great things. The problem is that in those kind of studies, right, we have operational definitions, and, right, it's what the researcher thinks, right, these things say or what they mean. And in Q, we don't really care what the researcher thinks they say, right? It's about the interpretation of those items, those statements by the participants. It's one of the reasons why we interview them post-sort, because we want to gain insight. So, like, back to my retention study, right, my factor 6, I know I have one African American female who explicitly explained, right, why she doesn't feel she belongs in this engineering program or the university, and how distanced everything is academically from, right, the African American community and organizations on campus. The other 5 people on that view, they didn't really talk about why they didn't belong. Right? If I had set up the study so that I could do follow-up interviews, right, then I would have followed up with some of them and asked them why they feel like they don't belong. It could be all kinds of different reasons why. I could guess, right? But how they interpreted, right, belonging, and how they interpreted those statements could be like my African American female, could be something different. I just don't know. I'm going to have to do probably, well, I'm already working on plans for a follow-up study where I want to change my Q sample a little bit to focus in on those aspects of retention in engineering. But the upshot is, right, it's their interpretation of these statements and what they mean to them. There's not a way to validate that. There's no expert validity, right? I'm the expert. Each participant is the expert in what those items say to them. And so we can't, right, validate the items. We can't validate the sort, right? As close as we come to validating the items is trying to, right, understand if there is a difference or how different participants may have seen, right, the statement about, right, my belonging within this program, for instance. So, but I do think that's it's a really hard thing for quantitative people to comprehend. And I will say that I am just as guilty about, well, only for the IRB. Only for the IRB do I ever call it a Q survey. And that's because otherwise, and maybe it would be better now, but in the beginning, they were like, what is this? And so if I called it a Q survey, they were like, it's a survey. We know about surveys. And it just made my life easier, right? But we should never call them Q surveys outside of, right, helping people in diverse areas who might, review a whole lot of different IRB proposals. We need to make it simpler for them. But again, it's part of differentiating that quantitative thinking from Q. We have, and I think it gets especially confusing because we have so much math in the analysis part. It makes it, right, confusing. It's kind of like we're on two factors. We're on the qualitative factor and the quantitative factor at the same time. And it makes it confusing for those who are just on the quantitative factor, especially. But I think that, as Joanna said, right, sometimes it's hard for the qualitative people because sometimes, right, our software just seems like a big black box and then we push some buttons. Not that quantitative people don't do that with SPSS. I could go on and on about that, but that's a whole different story. But I've known plenty of people, grad students, who did that, and then, it's their dissertation, and I ask them questions. They have no idea. Somebody told them it was, they had to do a t-test. What is a t-test? Why would you use a t-test instead of an f-test? I don't know. Because somebody told me to do a t-test. So we have that same kind of thing. It gets brought up more often. I guess that's really. Do you have something to say, Diane?
Well, what you're explaining in such detail is that subjectivity is not just the item. So you can't do a validity on the items because we're looking at subjectivity of all of them together and each person. And here's the conundrum. We want to know the subjectivity of each person, but just because each person reported it doesn't mean we say it's generalized back to people like them. It's generalized to the topic. And it's very different. That's the hard part because, you have to student, you're going to talk students, so now if you've got a factor of African-American women, so another African-American woman comes in, this is how they're going to think.
Right.
That's the wrong part of
yes.
generalizability. That's generalizing to people.
Mm-hmm.
And it's so easy to do that. There's two big mistakes that I've seen in manuscripts. Both of them have to do with the word percentage. 50% of the farmers think like factor one. Wrong. We don't know if 50% of the farmers think that because we don't know about the farmers. Or even 50% of type 2, factor array 2 are women. Don't go there. Just don't use the word percentage because it triggers generalizability in terms of statistical generalizability, not substantive. So avoid the words percentage anywhere in your findings and really start to think about that conundrum of wanting to know so much about the individual, but it's not by individual items.
Yeah, and it made me think of something else, and now it's gone.
You mentioned percentage twice.
Oh.
in a way that I just wanted to make sure that people know that we're not doing that,
Right.
because that triggers it.
Yeah. I mean, I like to say, because reviewers like it if you say, and this factor had, 25 students on it. They were all mechanical engineering majors. None of them changed their major. You know, 22 were males and 3 were females. I think that's okay, but you can't then, as you get to your discussion and conclusion, then say, well, this has to do with white males. Factor 1 is the white male factor, because I think it's really the same thing that we run into when we start talking about variance accounted for by the different factors, right? Because that implies that, right, factor 1, right, accounts for 33% of the variance. Right? That implies that that's a stronger view and that it takes up a greater portion of the population. Well, we don't know that. We don't know that, and we don't care. Because we're only interested in the phenomenon, not in the percentages or the variance accounted for, right? We just want to know about these types of people. There are those who then say that they'll use surveys to figure out, right, to count the noses and figure out how many people in, right, some random selection of population, right, identifies with factor 1 and identifies with factor 2. I don't know that I'm real gung-ho about that, because I find that I don't care. What I'm more interested in are the types. So like when I've done these studies with my students, just you can think of it in that way, right? So I could have 20 students this semester, and half of them love my flipped class style where we do active learning, right? Doesn't mean that next semester's class, 50% of them are going to love the flipped classroom, right? Maybe 2/3 will. Maybe 10% will, right? But I don't care, right? What I do to make it more welcoming to a new class, right, is based on the types of students that I've found in previous studies and what they wanted, right? So for my first, they want to know why it was flipped. So why would you do this, right? And they were looking for different things. So I brought it into my classroom. Q results tend to be very pragmatic, I think. So, did you have a question, Roella?
Yes, I unmuted now. Yes, I have a question, and I'm sorry, I always speak so long-winded. So, in my study, from the 3 factors that I found, and of course I do know it's students and lecturers and senior strategic communicators and creative directors. So it's a mix of different people, and I chose them purposefully, and there's 4 in every category. So what's interesting for me is never actually, are they old, are they young, are they white, are they black, are they Indian? So for me, that's not the interesting part. The interesting part is how they think. And and I think this is actually what we're talking about here. When you're speaking of generalizability, the one factor is okay with ambiguity. So I'm linking it to the whole thing of the light and the duality of light, quality, and that quantum element, because that's also something that's been written about in narratives, quantum narratives in organizations. So and this one view, which happens now to be, if I look at the people, they are from different races, and they are more, they're not necessarily more experienced, but the reason the factor is open-minded, okay with non-linearity, very happy with working with complexity. Whereas the first factor is very still, we must do things by the book. And in that group, there are more students, but there are also older strategic communicators, and there are people from different races and all of that. So now, I'm not sure yet whether I need to say anything about who they are. I'm trying to speak of how they are. But there's so much, when I read things, and even so many of the Q articles, it's as if people then get to that thing of what you just said, Diane, of the percentage. Like, and I don't want to speak about the percentage, but how do I phrase it? I don't know if you hear my question. Do I just ignore demographics? Because when you spoke now of your African-American engineering student, and another African-American engineering student might feel opposite. Mm-hmm. So it's not about race or culture, or it's about mindset. And I mean, that's what my study is about in any case. So do I need to comment on that? Do I just need to explain? Can I just ignore that element? And I want to tell you why this is important. My favorite book is A Wrinkle in Time. I don't know if any of you know it. Mm-hmm. And in this book, and I think, Johanne, when you spoke earlier about how do you explain it to people, I thought I want to tell you that's a good way. And I actually thought of it only now while you were speaking. In the book, there's the witches who, what, where, and when, or those three witches, and they take these characters to a planet where size doesn't matter. And you're equal whether you are, I can't even remember, I don't know whether it's in A Wrinkle in Time or in the book about the brothers. So there are two of the many books. I've read them all, but there are two. The one goes inside the cells, and the other one goes to planets. The travels goes to planets. But the point is, an electron or a mitochondria can be equal to a large tree. It's not about the size, it's about a sort of the essence of the thing. And for me, that is the magic. Well, that's what I found in my reading, and I'm loving this study, even though it drives me up the wall, that the superpower of Q is to change all of that so that we can hear the voice. I don't know if this makes sense. Is this what do I reflect? I can put this, of course, in my reflection or my final chapter or whatever. Is it valid to ignore, or is it valid to write about it? That's my question. I hope you understand.
I understand. I have found that in general, so first of all, I usually ask only a few demographic questions, mostly because I find that it doesn't ever matter, but I still have some demographic because people always want to know, well, are those men? Are they women? Are they this? Are they that? Right? And I think it's just because researchers are so used to, right, tagging these external characteristics to people and assuming that that's how we're going to find out how they think. And the beauty of Q is it has nothing to do with it. So usually I include the demographics and then I quote, I pretty sure it's Steve Brown in Political Subjectivity who says, and as expected, the demographics have little to say about
Okay.
these types of views, right? That we asked, it didn't really matter. I mean, even going back to my right, factor 4, I didn't ask a race question. She volunteered that she was Black. And it was important to her for me to understand that that's why she didn't belong. Were the other people on that factor Black? I don't know. I didn't ask, right? And they might not feel like they belong for completely different reasons. They're LGBTQ, they're from an urban setting, they're from a rural setting, they could be there's all kinds of reasons why people feel they don't belong, right? They're introverts, they don't have friends. I mean, the possibilities are endless, but what's really important is that one of the ways that we can retain students is do better in helping, right, them feel connected, but also, right, being more welcoming or being just cognizant that, right, that the power structure in engineering, which tends to be white male, right,
Yeah.
is impactful on students, possibly for a variety of reasons. So
what I love, what I love what you're saying now is be cognizant of that some people do not feel welcome there, and not saying be cognizant that Black females don't feel,
right,
but some people, and yeah, and that had one done a survey and did, you know, that typical things that you spoke last of the person who just did the peer evaluation, that would have been the result, maybe. That it is because of people of color, or it is because of LGBTQI plus, or whatever. And it might not be the reason because that type of research doesn't go underneath.
right.
Yeah.
It would be,
Thank you very much.
It would be like the first really big retention study about STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math, was by Seymour and Hewitt in 1997. And they did interviews, in-depth interviews. And what they did was report findings in aggregate, which was that, you know, it's problems with teaching didactic lectures that are boring, problems with advising, right? But it's so much more complicated than that. And they kind of knew it was more complicated. They just didn't know how to dig that up. They just kept saying, well, but there are students who retain who also say that, you know, the teaching was horrible and advising was horrible, but then they stayed. So why? Q lets us see why, but it's not linking to external characteristics. It's things that are inside of them that we can't really determine where that came from. And I don't know that we care where it came from. It just is. Diane wants to say something.
Nevertheless, I think that if you have a factor array that has items in the understanding of the array that leads to experience, there's things about these people that they have more experience, they have more life viewpoints, they have more open-heartedness. Then I think going back and looking at the trends in demographics is helpful in interpreting the factor. So I think descriptive, exactly what Sue's saying, being descriptive of how the definers define that, how the definer sorts demographics are lined up is important, especially if it supports part of your interpretation. We have one that looked at emotional development, an article that Elizabeth and Albright and I wrote that has to do with children emotional development, and there were items in the concourse and then therefore the Q sample that related to advanced development. And then there were indicators in the demographics that helped us understand one of the factors, not all of them. And then the careful thing is in chapter 5, don't write the demographics as a conclusion. Write it as something that needs further study. You can't conclude on it because you can't generalize. So I think that's the point Sue's making.
Yeah, yeah.
Just careful of those conclusions. When you read some people's conclusions, they conclude about anything they might have found on the sentence level. So I think we're running out of time too.
Yeah.
I want to thank you so much, Sue, for doing this for us.
Oh, sure. Thanks for roping me in.
So would it be possible for you, I don't know if you would think it'd be valuable for you to circulate your presentation or does it...
I actually, when I recorded this, I had my presentation kind of on the side, so, and I'll just post it up on my YouTube channel.
Oh, that'd be lovely. Thank you.
Oh, sure. My pleasure.